So good to have you join us today. Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Jun in Seoul. We have a lot of stories lined up for you today, so let's get started with a look at the day's highlights. Round 2 begins for prosecutors as they raid more of Lotte Group's key business units today over alleged slush funds and murky governance. The Bank of Korea sent a clear message to the government last week as it lowered its key rate. We did our part, now do yours. So is it time for the government to introduce extra fiscal measures to help boost the economy? We'll sit down with an expert to talk about this. But first, President Park Geun-hye has called on Korea's public sector to lead reforms in finance, labor, and education. She made the remarks on Tuesday at a gathering of representatives from 126 public agencies who reported on their reform efforts and shared best practices in restructuring. The majority of the institutions have adopted performance-based salaries, and several have either undertaken mergers and acquisitions or reduced redundancies with their agencies. Since the beginning of her term, President Park has pushed to normalize public institutions, focusing on reducing their debts and improving management. Korea's national wealth was nearly 8 times larger than the nation's gross domestic product as of the end of last year. The Bank of Korea says the amount was roughly $10 trillion, up around 6% from a year earlier. This includes tangible assets like real estate and automobiles, as well as financial assets. Real estate, including land and buildings, took up almost 90% of the total sum. Now, the trend of real estate assets taking up a large portion of total wealth has picked up pace since 2014, following government projects such as the designation of Sejong City as the country's new administrative center. The probe into one of Korea's biggest conglomerates is picking up a head of steam. Prosecutors on Tuesday raided additional business units of Lotte Group as the authorities delved deeper into suspicions of slush funds and shady corporate governance. Our Kim Min-ji is on this story for us today.
The investigation into the country's 5th largest conglomerate is forging ahead. Prosecutors launched a second raid on Lotte Group on Tuesday, searching 10 of its business units, including Lotte Engineering and Construction and Lotte Chemical. The raid also covered the homes of key executives. Prosecutors say they confiscated account books as well as documents on land transactions and financial deals among the companies. They believe these firms may be connected to a slush fund created in the process of mergers between Hotel Lotte and 2 of the group's resorts. The latest move follows a raid of the group's headquarters and 6 of its units on Friday, as part of a widening probe into slush fund allegations, as well as claims that the group stockpiled wealth through internal trading among its business arms. On Monday, prosecutors said they found over $2 million in cash and a stash of documents belonging to Shin Gyuk-ho, the founder of Lotte Group, at a private residence in Seoul. They are looking into whether it's part of a slush fund, as they have also traced over $25 million in suspicious funds belonging to Shin and his second son Dongbin, the chairman of Lotte Group. In light of the probe, the conglomerate's business plans are also taking a hit. Hotel Lotte has indefinitely shelved a plan to go public, while Lotte Chemical has also withdrawn its bid to take over a U.S.-based petrochemical firm. This has triggered negative sentiment, giving Lotte Group a torrid time on the local stock market. Roughly $940 million was wiped off from the group shares on Monday alone, while for the month of June, Lotte's market capitalization has shrunk by $1.8 billion. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily.
After last week's rate cut, eyes are now on the government and whether it will introduce a supplementary budget in line with the central bank's efforts to spur the struggling domestic economy. Take a look.
The Bank of Korea cut its benchmark interest rate last week as part of its efforts to boost domestic consumption and investment. But many economists say a rate trim alone is not enough to bolster economic growth amid weak consumer demand and tepid inflation, and that the government has to implement extra fiscal measures. And they are not alone in this call for more stimulus.
We cannot escape the current slow growth and weakening growth potential simply with our monetary policy.
So amid growing calls for a supplementary budget, eyes are on whether the government will respond to such demands later this month, as the finance ministry is expected to announce a set of measures on propping up growth.
And to tell us more about this, Professor Joon from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. So good to see you, Professor.
Happy to be here.
So last week, the Bank of Korea surprised us all with a rate cut, but the central bank also said that the monetary policy alone is not enough to boost economic growth. What does it mean by this?
Okay, well, if you look at Korea, the last two rate cuts that we had didn't really seem to have that much of an effect. And then globally overall, if you look at almost all advanced countries, the monetary policy, interest rate cuts do not seem to have as much power as it did in the past. That's why you had so much talk about whether the United States or Europe was in a liquidity trap or not, because under liquidity trap, a monetary policy has no effect at all, at least theoretically. So overall, I think all the major central banks have been disappointed by the lack of power of monetary policy.
So if the government decides not to draw up a supplementary budget, then would this rate cut bring more bad than good?
Well, I wouldn't say more bad than good, but I think there's a real good chance that it will be wasted. Now, the best kind of stimulation policy that you can have, expansionary policy you can have, is a combination of monetary policy and fiscal policy. Now, the monetary policy, well, it's been a bit of a surprise, but it has taken place. But fiscal policy, we're not too sure yet. So I think the market is somewhat discounting this particular rate cut.
Now, talking about markets didn't really react to the BOK's decision last week, despite the fact that it caught them by surprise. Why so?
Okay, well, some people are arguing that market really did expect this rate cut. Well, maybe it's because just me, but the rate cut actually did catch me by surprise. And apparently it caught a lot of other people by surprise as well, including a lot of international investment banks. So you would have expected to see some kind of a reaction in the stock market. We've seen some reaction in the bond market, but the bond prices are directly tied to the interest rate, so that's no surprise there. But if people expected the economy to get better because of the monetary policy, and if this rate cut really did come as a surprise, then you would have expected more investment into stocks because they would expect the future economy to be better. Right now, the stock market right after the rate cut really didn't respond that much, and over the last few days, it's actually on the downside. So it seems like, at least for the market at least, they're discounting the effect of the rate cut. Now, we'll have to wait and see anywhere between a month to 6 months on the real effect of the rate cut. But still, the fact that the stock market hasn't responded well is disappointing.
Now, going back to the possibility of drawing up a supplementary budget, what are some economic indicators that the Korean government is going to have to review in deciding whether or not to introduce extra budget to boost growth?
Okay, well, we'll have to look at the variables which deal with economic growth. Consumption is probably going to be the most important, but also investment as well. Contrast that with the increase in government debt. Now, the KDI last year, as well as the current vice minister in charge of economic affairs, has warned that if we have too much of a deficit this year, government deficit, then it'll create more debt, and that'll hurt us a lot in the future. But on the other hand, because the economy has been so sluggish, I think there needs to be some kind of an extra stimulus. So they're going to have to look at the short-term payoff versus the long-term harm of increasing government debt.
Now, the IMF and the OECD also advised Korea to expand fiscal policies, saying that Korea actually has a high level of fiscal soundness compared to other countries. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, if you look at the OECD countries, well, the average government debt to GDP ratio is 110%, and Japan is over 230%.
Oh, wow.
So compared to those countries, Korea is actually doing well because, at least according to the OECD, IMF, IMF standards, we're only we're slightly less than 40%. So from that point of view, Korea has a lot of room to maneuver, except a lot of Koreans argue that, well, that covers the OECD IMF definition, but if you look at the government debt theoretically, then it has to cover everything that government may be responsible for payment. And once you include things like the debt of the state-owned enterprises or some of the private companies that the government is guaranteeing, that rate comes down up to about 60%. Now, the reason that that's a bit scary is because, well, some people argue that for developing countries, the debt to GDP ratio should not go over 90%.
Okay.
And for advanced countries, not over 100 or 110%.
And it's also going to be a fine act of balancing for the finance ministry, considering that it has to weigh the demand for growth and financial stability. So do you think this supplementary budget, do you think this is going to place too heavy of a burden on the government?
Well, I don't think so. Now, there's a lot of differing opinions on this, but I think the OECD, IMF has a point in saying that Korea has some room to maneuver. And also, the monetary policy so far hasn't shown that much of a kick. So if government wants some kind of a stimulatory policy, expansionary policy this year, I think fiscal policy or a combination of fiscal and monetary policy is all we really have left.
Then do you think now is the right time to introduce an extra budget? And if so, that how big should this supplementary budget should be? How big should it be?
I think it's actually a bit late. And the reason is that I think if they are going to have a supplementary budget, expansionary government policy, government fiscal policy, they should have announced it with the monetary policy. Now that the BOK, I think, is not excited about that idea because they want to prove their independence. But I think a show of cooperation and combined force of fiscal and monetary policy would have done a lot more good than just announcing monetary policy by itself. Now, as to the size, well, one of the reasons that a lot of some economists are concerned about using fiscal policy is that actually what's called the fiscal government expenditure multiplier for Korea is fairly low. It's 0.8%, which means that if the government expenditure goes up by 1% of GDP, the actual GDP only goes up by 0.8%. So in some sense, you're losing money by using fiscal policy. But even given that, I think because of the problems that we're likely to have in the second half of the year, I think it's very important that the fiscal policy be designed well so that it goes to the areas where you need the money. But as far as the size of it, I think a size similar to last year, which was, I believe, around 11 trillion won, or maybe slightly higher, is warranted.
All right, so we'll definitely keep an eye on what kind of decision the government makes this month or in the months to come. Thanks so much for coming in today, Professor.
Thank you.
It appears that a clear majority of British voters now want Britain out of the European Union, with just 9 days to go before the June 23rd referendum. In a joint poll conducted by telephone and online from June 10th to the 13th, public opinion research company ICM and The Guardian found that 53% favored Britain leaving the EU, while 47% wanted to remain. The poll results do not include those who are undecided. When ICM conducted the same survey 2 weeks ago, the split between leave and remain in the EU was at 52% to 48%. Microsoft is acquiring LinkedIn in a multi-billion-dollar deal that's expected to help expand the social network for professionals. Our Oh Jung-hee tells us more.
Microsoft is buying professional social networking site LinkedIn for $26.2 billion. It'll pay $196 a share in an all-cash transaction, an almost 50% premium to LinkedIn's stock market value as of last Friday. Under the terms of the deal, LinkedIn will retain its own brand and independence, and CEO Jeff Weiner will stay on. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said the two companies share a mission of connecting the world's professionals and helping people work more efficiently.
Our customers are going to see these new delightful scenarios by bringing together their professional cloud, the way they use the everyday office tools, and their professional network.
It's a truly unique and unprecedented combination at scale. And you think about LinkedIn's 433 million members and Microsoft's global footprint of over 1 billion customers and all of the possibilities.
Microsoft has largely missed out on the consumer web boom dominated by Google and Facebook. Through this deal, it is expected that Microsoft will gain a solid foothold in the social network services market, mainly targeting professional users.
It's an expensive deal, but I think it does make some sense in the long term. Microsoft wants to become more and more of a services company, and I think what they're seeing with LinkedIn is the opportunity to create some interesting services, which, oh, by the way, they can link in with Office 365 and some of their other products.
The deal is one of the largest tech takeovers on record and the largest acquisition by far in Microsoft's history. Oh Jung-hee, Business Daily.
And that brings us to the end. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow with more business news that matters to you. Until then, goodbye.